Sarah never thought she would be fighting for the right to see her own children. This was the story of how her world shattered in a single day. It was a crisp autumn morning when everything changed. The leaves were just beginning to turn, painting the world in hues of red and gold. Sarah had been up since dawn, preparing breakfast for her two children, Emma and Liam. The kitchen was filled with the aroma of pancakes and the sound of their laughter. Though it was a moment of pure joy, one that she had clung to during the darkest days of her marriage. For years, Sarah had endured the emotional roller coaster of living with Michael, her now ex-husband. His mood swings were unpredictable, his words cutting deeper than any physical blow ever could. She had become an expert at hiding bruises, both physical and emotional, from the world. But that morning, as she watched her children's carefree smiles, she knew she could not continue this charade any longer. Sarah had made the decision to leave weeks ago. Quietly, she had been squirreling away money, making plans, and gathering courage. That morning, she had planned to take the kids to school and then disappear, leaving behind the life she had known for so long. As she helped Emma tie her shoelaces and adjusted Liam's backpack, Sarah felt a mix of fear and determination coursing through her veins. She hugged them tightly, breathing in their scent, trying to memorize every detail of their faces. Little did she know it would be the last time she would hold them for a very long time. They were just about to leave when Sarah heard the sound of tires screeching to a halt outside their house. Her heart began to race as she peered through the curtains. 2 police cars had pulled up, and officers were already making their way to their front door. Time seemed to slow down as Sarah opened the door. The officers' faces were grim, their words a blur as they explained why they were there. Michael had filed for emergency custody, claiming Sarah was unstable and a danger to their children. He had somehow discovered her plans to leave and had acted first. Sarah watched in horror as Emma and Liam were led away, their confused and tearful faces etched into her memory. She wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything to keep them with her. But she stood frozen, the weight of what was happening crushing her. As the police cars drove away with her children inside, Sarah collapsed to the ground. The world around her faded away, and all she could hear was the echo of her own heartbeat. In that moment, she realized that her decision to seek safety for herself and her children had backfired in the worst possible way. Sarah did not know then that this was just the beginning of a long and painful journey. She could not have imagined the battles she would face, the system she would have to fight, or the strength she would need to find within herself. All she knew was that her world had been torn apart, and she would do anything to put it back together again. The day of the first court hearing arrived faster than Sarah had anticipated. She had spent sleepless nights preparing, gathering evidence of Michael's abuse, and praying that the truth would prevail. As she walked into the courthouse, her heart pounded in her chest and her palms were slick with sweat. The courtroom was cold and imposing. Sarah felt small and vulnerable as she took her seat, acutely aware of Michael's presence on the other side of the room. He looked calm and collected, a stark contrast to her barely contained anxiety. As the hearing began, Sarah listened in disbelief as Michael's lawyer painted a picture of her that she barely recognized. They portrayed her as unstable, unfit, and even dangerous. They twisted her attempts to leave an abusive situation into evidence of her inability to provide a stable home for their children. Sarah had expected the truth to be obvious, for the judge to see through Michael's lies. But as the hearing progressed, she realized with growing horror that the system she had trusted to protect her and her children was failing them. Michael's lawyer presented carefully crafted evidence, out-of-context text messages, statements from witnesses who had never seen the full picture of their home life, and even Sarah's own therapy records, which they had somehow obtained. They used her attempts to seek help for depression caused by years of abuse as proof of her instability. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she found her voice shaking. She tried to explain the years of emotional and physical abuse, the fear that had driven her to plan their escape. But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The judge's eyes were cold and unsympathetic. The decision, when it came, felt like a physical blow. The judge ruled in Michael's favor, granting him temporary full custody of Emma and Liam. Sarah was allowed only supervised visitation, pending a full investigation into her mental state and ability to care for the children. As the gavel fell, sealing the decision, Sarah felt the world spinning around her. She watched as Michael smirked, his victory evident in the set of his shoulders as he left the courtroom. Hi, Mrs. Touching Stories here. Enjoying the story? Subscribe now, like, and comment to catch all the upcoming emotions. In the days that followed, the full weight of what had happened settled on Sarah. She had naively believed that the truth would be enough, that the system would protect those who needed it most. Instead, she found herself fighting not just against Michael, but against an entire system that seemed designed to work against her. Sarah realized then that this battle would be longer and harder than she had ever imagined. The system that she had hoped would be her ally had become her adversary. She would have to fight not only for her children, but against the very institutions she had trusted to deliver justice. As she sat in her empty house, surrounded by the echoes of her children's laughter, Sarah felt a resolve hardening within her. She knew then that she would have to become stronger, smarter, and more determined than she had ever been. This was not just about her anymore. It was about exposing the flaws in a system that failed to protect those most vulnerable. Sarah did not know how, but she knew she would find a way to fight back. She had to, for Emma, for Liam, and for every other parent caught in the web of a system that did not understand the complexities of abuse and survival. This was only the beginning, and she was prepared to do whatever it took to bring her children home. The weeks following the court's decision were the darkest of Sarah's life. She found herself sinking into a deep depression, barely able to get out of bed most days. The house, once filled with the laughter and chaos of family life, now felt oppressively silent. Every corner held memories that stabbed at her heart. There were moments when the pain became so unbearable that Sarah contemplated ending it all. The thought of living without her children, of them growing up believing the lies Michael had told about her, was almost too much to bear. She had lost everything: her children, her home, her sense of self. She wondered what was left to live for. It was during one of these low points that Sarah received a call from an old friend, Jessica. She had heard about Sarah's situation and insisted she join her at a support group for mothers who had lost custody of their children. At first, Sarah resisted. She questioned how sitting in a room full of other broken women could possibly help. But Jessica was persistent, and eventually Sarah agreed, if only to stop her calls. The first meeting was a turning point. As Sarah listened to the stories of other women who had been through similar ordeals, she felt a spark of something she had not experienced in a long time: hope. These women had faced the same system, the same prejudices, the same pain. Yet here they were, fighting, surviving, some even thriving. One woman's story in particular struck a chord with Sarah. She had lost custody of her children years ago, but had fought back by educating herself about the law. She had eventually regained custody and was now working as a paralegal, helping other mothers navigate the complex legal system. Her words ignited something within Sarah. She had always been a fighter, even if recent events had made her forget that. She realized that to win this battle, she needed to understand the rules of engagement. The system had been used against her, but perhaps she could learn to use it in her favor. That night, Sarah made a decision that would change the course of her life. She would go back to school and study law. It would not be easy. She had been out of school for years, and the financial strain would be significant. But she knew it was necessary. She needed to understand the intricacies of family law to learn how to navigate the system that had failed her. As Sarah enrolled in classes and began her studies, she felt a sense of purpose returning to her life. Every page she read, every concept she grasped, felt like a step closer to her children. The depression that had clouded her mind began to lift as she focused on her goal. It was not an easy journey. There were nights when Sarah stayed up until dawn, poring over legal texts, her eyes burning with exhaustion. There were days when the weight of her separation from Emma and Liam threatened to crush her. But she persevered, driven by a determination she had not known she possessed. With each passing day, Sarah grew stronger, more knowledgeable, more prepared for the fight ahead. She was no longer just a victim of the system. She was becoming someone who could challenge it, who could use it to fight for justice. As she sat in her tiny apartment, surrounded by law books and case studies, Sarah felt a fierce resolve settle over her. She was going to become the advocate she needed when this nightmare began. She would fight not just for herself, but for every mother who had been wronged by a system that did not understand the complexities of abuse and family dynamics. Sarah did not know then how long this journey would take or what obstacles she would face along the way. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would not stop until she had her children back in her arms and until she had done everything in her power to change the system that had torn them apart. As Sarah delved deeper into her legal studies, she began to see her past through a new lens. What she had once dismissed as normal marital discord, she now recognized as clear patterns of abuse. Armed with this knowledge, she started meticulously documenting every interaction with Michael, every supervised visit with Emma and Liam, and every piece of their shared history that she could recall. It was during one of these deep dives into their past that Sarah stumbled upon something she had completely forgotten. Years ago, she had set up a cloud storage account to back up photos of the children. As she scrolled through the forgotten archive, she found a folder she did not recognize. With trembling hands, she clicked it open. What Sarah found made her blood run cold. There were audio recordings, dozens of them. As she listened, she heard Michael's voice, filled with rage, spewing threats and verbal abuse. She heard the sound of objects breaking, of her own voice pleading for calm. She had unknowingly captured years of abuse, a truth she had so hard to hide from the world. Sarah's initial elation at finding this evidence quickly gave way to anxiety. She knew that presenting these recordings to the court could change everything, but she also knew it would not be easy. The system had already labeled her as unstable, and she feared they would dismiss this evidence as fabricated or obtained illegally. Sarah spent weeks preparing her case, consulting with her professors and the women from her support group. She practiced presenting the evidence, anticipating every possible objection. When the day of the hearing finally arrived, she felt a mix of determination and terror. As Sarah presented the recordings to the court, she watched the faces of the judge and the lawyers. She saw shock, disbelief, and then, finally, understanding dawn in their eyes. Michael's carefully constructed facade began to crumble as the truth of his behavior was laid bare. However, the battle was far from over. Michael's lawyers fought back hard, questioning the authenticity of the recordings and Sarah's motives for presenting them now. They argued that even if the recordings were real, they were from the past and did not reflect Michael's current behavior. The hearing stretched on for hours, each minute feeling like an eternity. When the judge finally spoke, Sarah held her breath. While he did not immediately reverse the custody decision, he ordered a full investigation into the new evidence. It was not the complete victory Sarah had hoped for, but it was a crack in the wall that had been built against her. As Sarah left the courthouse that day, she felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in months. The truth was finally coming to light, and the system that had been so quick to believe Michael's lies was being forced to reconsider. But Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The investigation would be thorough and potentially painful. She would have to relive years of abuse to expose the darkest parts of her past to scrutiny. And even then, there was no guarantee that it would be enough to bring her children home. As she drove home, Sarah's mind raced with the challenges that lay ahead. She knew the road would be long and fraught with obstacles. Michael would not give up easily, and the system's bias would not disappear overnight. But for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt a spark of real hope. Sarah looked at the photo of Emma and Liam on her dashboard, their smiling faces giving her strength. She made a silent promise to them and to herself. No matter how long it took, no matter what she had to endure, she would not stop fighting until they were back in her arms. Hi, Mrs. Touching Stories here. Enjoying the story? Subscribe now, like and comment to catch all the upcoming emotions. The truth was finally coming to light, and she was ready to face whatever came next. As the legal battle dragged on, Sarah found herself caught in a relentless storm of emotional and financial turmoil. Each day brought new challenges, new hurdles to overcome, and the weight of it all threatened to crush her. The financial strain was immense. Legal fees piled up, draining Sarah's savings and forcing her to take on extra work alongside her studies. She moved to a tiny studio apartment, cutting every possible expense to funnel more money into the fight for her children. There were nights when she went to bed hungry, having chosen to pay for another hour with her lawyer instead of buying groceries. Emotionally, Sarah was a wreck. The constant stress of court appearances, the pain of limited visitations with Emma and Liam, and the exhaustion of juggling work, studies, and the legal battle left her drained. She began to have panic attacks, her body rebelling against the constant state of anxiety she lived in. There were moments when the thought of giving up seemed almost sweet. Sarah would lie awake at night, imagining a life where she accepted defeat, where she stopped fighting and tried to build a new life without her children. The idea was both terrifying and tempting in its promise of peace. One particularly dark night, after a grueling day in court where it seemed like every word out of her mouth was twisted against her, Sarah found herself standing on the balcony of her apartment, looking down at the street below. For a brief, horrifying moment, she considered ending it all. The pain, the struggle, it all seemed too much to bear. It was the sound of her phone ringing that pulled Sarah back from the edge. It was Emma, calling from her father's house for their weekly phone call. Hearing her voice, telling her about her day at school and how much she missed her, reignited the fire in Sarah's soul. She couldn't give up. Not now, not ever. The next day, as Sarah walked into the courthouse for what felt like the 100th time, she noticed a new face on the bench. Judge Elena Rodriguez was filling in for their regular judge, and something about her piercing gaze made Sarah sit up straighter. As the proceedings began, Sarah noticed Judge Rodriguez watching Michael intently. She asked pointed questions, pressing for details where their regular judge had always seemed satisfied with vague answers. For the first time, Sarah saw Michael squirm under scrutiny. During Sarah's testimony, Judge Rodriguez listened with an intensity she had never experienced before. She asked for clarifications, delved deeper into the evidence Sarah presented. Sarah could see the wheels turning in the judge's mind as she pieced together the complex puzzle of their case. At the end of the day, Judge Rodriguez made a decision that would change the course of their case. She ordered a comprehensive psychological evaluation for both Michael and Sarah, as well as for Emma and Liam. She also increased Sarah's visitation time, citing the need for the children to maintain a strong relationship with both parents during the investigation. As Sarah left the courthouse that day, she felt a glimmer of hope that she hadn't experienced in months. Judge Rodriguez had seen through the smoke and mirrors, had recognized that there was more to their story than what appeared on the surface. That night, as Sarah prepared for her extended visit with Emma and Liam, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight was far from over, and she knew there would be more challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like the scales of justice might finally be tipping in her favor. Sarah looked at herself in the mirror, noting the dark circles under her eyes, the stress lines that had appeared on her forehead. The fight had taken its toll, but it had also made her stronger. She was not the same woman who had walked into that first hearing, naive and unprepared. She was a fighter, a survivor, and she was ready for whatever came next. As she fell asleep that night, Sarah held on to the hope that Judge Rodriguez had given her. The universe had sent her a sign just when she needed it most, reminding her that there was still good in the world, still people willing to look beyond the surface and see the truth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she was ready to face them. The price of the fight had been high, but the reward, her children's future, was worth every sacrifice. As the legal battle continued, Sarah found herself growing increasingly frustrated with the slow pace of the justice system. Despite the positive turn with Judge Rodriguez, she knew that the fight was far from over. It was during one sleepless night, as she scrolled through her phone, that an idea struck her. If the system was failing her, perhaps it was time to take her story to the public. With trembling hands, Sarah created a social media account dedicated to sharing her journey. She was careful not to violate any court orders or reveal sensitive information about Emma and Liam, but she began to share her experiences with the family court system, the challenges she faced as a mother fighting for her children, and the broader issues of domestic abuse and judicial bias. At first, Sarah's posts received little attention, but as she continued to share, pouring her heart out in late-night writings, people began to take notice. Other mothers in similar situations started reaching out, sharing their own stories. Slowly, a community began to form around her account. One day, a post Sarah made about the financial strain of the legal battle went viral. Suddenly, her inbox was flooded with messages of support, offers of help, and shares from people outraged by her situation. Hi, Mrs. Touching Stories here. Enjoying the story? Subscribe now, like, and comment to catch all the upcoming emotions. Local news outlets began reaching out for interviews, and before she knew it, Sarah found herself in front of cameras, sharing her story with a wider audience. The media attention brought both benefits and challenges. On one hand, it put pressure on the family court system to examine her case more closely. On the other, Michael's lawyers used it as ammunition, claiming she was seeking attention and manipulating public opinion. But Sarah pressed on, using every platform available to her to shed light on the flaws in the system. She spoke at local events, participated in podcasts, and even started a blog detailing the intricacies of family law that she was learning in her studies. As Sarah's following grew, so did the public pressure on the court. People began showing up at her hearings, holding signs of support outside the courthouse. Advocacy groups reached out, offering legal support and resources. Her story was no longer just her own. It had become a rallying cry for change in the family court system. The turning point came when a national news program decided to do an in-depth investigation into Sarah's case. They interviewed her, Michael, their friends and family, and even managed to speak with Emma and Liam with the court's permission. The resulting piece was a comprehensive look at their story, presenting evidence that had been overlooked or dismissed in earlier hearings. The night the program aired, Sarah sat in her tiny apartment, hands clasped tightly as she watched their lives unfold on the screen. As the credits rolled, her phone exploded with notifications. The public reaction was overwhelming. Justice for Sarah was trending, and calls for a review of her case were pouring in from all corners of the country. The next morning, Sarah received a call from her lawyer. The judge had called an emergency hearing in light of the new public information and the overwhelming response. As she walked into the courthouse that day, she was met with a sea of supporters, their voices rising in a chant of encouragement. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Judge Rodriguez, who had been following the public discourse closely, opened the session with a statement that made Sarah's heart soar. She announced that in light of the new evidence brought forth by the media investigation and the clear public interest in the case, she was ordering a complete review of all previous rulings. As Sarah sat there listening to the judge outline the next steps, she felt a wave of emotion wash over her. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in years they were tears of relief and hope. The tables had finally turned. Walking out of the courthouse that day, surrounded by supporters and flashing cameras, Sarah realized that her small personal fight had grown into something much larger. It was no longer just about Emma and Liam, but about every parent fighting against an unjust system, every child caught in the crossfire of a broken process. Sarah looked up at the sky, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. The road ahead was still long, but she was no longer walking it alone. Thousands of people were with her now, their voices joining hers in a call for justice. For the first time since this nightmare began, she allowed herself to truly believe that she would hold her children in her arms again. The game had changed, and now, finally, she had a real chance at winning. The day Sarah had both longed for and dreaded finally arrived. The courthouse was packed, filled with familiar faces and strangers alike, all united by her story that had captured the nation's attention. She could feel the weight of thousands of eyes upon her, the hopes and expectations of so many who had joined her fight. As Sarah entered the courtroom, her eyes immediately found Michael's. He seemed smaller somehow, less intimidating than she remembered. Perhaps it was because she was no longer the frightened woman he had known. She was a warrior now, forged by the trials she had faced. The trial began, and the hours dragged on. Witnesses were called, evidence was presented. Every word seemed laden with meaning, every moment crucial to the outcome. Sarah watched the judge's expressions carefully, trying to decipher his thoughts, but his face remained impassive. Finally, it was Sarah's turn to testify. As she took the stand, it felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. She looked at her lawyer, who nodded encouragingly, and then she began to speak. Sarah's voice trembled at first, but soon she found strength from deep within. She told her story, not just the cold, hard facts that were in the court records, but the emotional truth behind them. She spoke about the fear she had felt, the pain of being separated from her children, the struggle to pick herself up and fight for them. Sarah told the court that all she asked for was the chance to be a mother to her children, to love them, protect them, and watch them grow. She emphasized that she wasn't just there for herself, but for every child who deserves to have both parents in their life, free from fear and abuse. When Sarah finished, there was a deafening silence in the room. She could see tears in the eyes of some of the spectators, and even Michael's lawyer looked shaken. The jury's deliberations seemed to last an eternity. Each passing minute was torture, Sarah's heart beating so loudly she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. Finally, the jury returned, and the judge prepared to announce the verdict. Sarah closed her eyes, silently praying, clinging to the hope that had sustained her for so long. The judge began to speak, his voice resonating through the silent room. He announced that in this custody case involving Sarah Thompson and Michael Thompson, the court found that full custody of Emma and Liam Thompson be granted to their mother, Sarah Thompson. The words echoed in Sarah's ears, almost unreal. Tears began to stream down her face as the reality of the moment hit her. After years of struggle, of pain, of despair, she finally heard the words she had dreamed of for so long. The courtroom erupted in applause and shouts of joy. People Sarah didn't even know were hugging her, crying with her. Through her own tears, she saw Michael being led out, his mask of control finally crumbling. But none of that mattered at that moment. All Sarah could think about was Emma and Liam, about finally being able to hug them, to take them home, their home. As Sarah left the courthouse surrounded by a crowd of supporters and journalists, she knew this wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for all the mothers fighting, for all the children trapped in abusive situations, for everyone who refused to give up hope. The path ahead would still be challenging. There would be scars to heal, trust to rebuild. But for the first time in years, Sarah looked to the future with genuine hope. The fight was over. It was time to start living again. As Sarah headed to pick up Emma and Liam, her heart overflowed with love and gratitude. Finally, they were going home, together. The drive to pick up Emma and Liam felt like the longest journey of Sarah's life. Her heart raced with anticipation, joy, and a touch of anxiety. As she pulled up to the social services building, she took a deep breath, steadying herself for the moment she had dreamed of for so long. The moment Sarah saw them, time seemed to stand still. Emma, now taller and more mature than she remembered, and Liam, his face a perfect blend of the baby she knew and the boy he was becoming. For a split second, they all froze, as if afraid this was just another dream. Then, with a cry of "Mom!" they ran into her arms. Sarah held them tight, tears streaming down her face, their small bodies pressed against hers. The weight of their embrace was the most beautiful burden she had ever felt. They stood there, crying and laughing, a tangle of arms and emotions, whole at last. As they drove home, their chatter filled the car, updating Sarah on every detail of their lives she had missed. Her heart ached with each story, each milestone she hadn't been there for, but she pushed aside the pain. They had the future now, and she was determined to make every moment count. That night, as Sarah tucked them into bed in their new rooms, the reality of their situation began to sink in. The battle was won, but the war had left its scars. She saw it in the way Emma hesitated before hugging her goodnight, in the nightmares that woke Liam in the early hours. they had a long road of healing ahead of them. In the quiet moments after they fell asleep, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. The pain, the struggle, the moments of despair, but also the strength she had found within herself, the support from unexpected places, the power of speaking out and fighting for what was right. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, they slowly began to rebuild their life together. There were challenges, adjusting to new routines, navigating co-parenting with Michael under the court's guidelines, helping the children process their emotions. But there were also moments of pure joy. First day of school pictures, family movie nights, impromptu dance parties in the kitchen. Throughout this time, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her journey wasn't over. Hi, Mrs. Touching Stories here. Enjoying the story? Subscribe now, like and comment to catch all the upcoming emotions. The messages kept coming, from mothers in similar situations, from advocates fighting for change in the family court system, from people inspired by her story. She realized that her experience, painful as it was, had given her a unique perspective and a platform to make a difference. One evening, as Sarah sat on the porch watching Emma and Liam play in the yard, she made a decision. She would use her voice, her story, to help others. She began by volunteering at a local women's shelter, offering support and guidance to mothers navigating the legal system. She started writing a book detailing her experiences and offering hope to those still in the midst of their battles. As Sarah's involvement grew, so did her understanding of the systemic issues at play. She found herself speaking at conferences, lobbying for legislative changes, and working with advocacy groups to push for reforms in the family court system. Her personal fight had evolved into a mission for change. It wasn't always easy. There were times when the weight of other people's stories, so similar to her own, threatened to overwhelm Sarah. But then she would look at Emma and Liam, thriving despite everything they had been through, and she would find the strength to continue. Years passed, and slowly they began to see change. Laws were amended, judges were given better training in domestic abuse cases, support systems were put in place for vulnerable families. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As Sarah stood looking out at a room full of advocates, survivors, and allies, she was filled with a sense of hope. Their voices, once silenced, now echoed through courtrooms and legislative halls. Their stories, once hidden, now shone a light on the darkest corners of a flawed system. Sarah's personal battle may have ended, but the fight for a fair system had only just begun. And this time she wasn't alone. They were a chorus of voices, a force for change, and they would not be silenced. As Sarah wrapped up her speech and stepped down from the podium, she caught sight of Emma and Liam in the audience, now teenagers, their faces beaming with pride. In that moment, she knew that every struggle, every tear, every sleepless night was worth it. Not just for them, but for every family that would come after them, seeking justice and fighting for their right to love and be loved. The journey continued, but now they walked it together, stronger for having weathered the storm and determined to light the way for others. Sarah's fight might have started as a solitary battle for her children, but it had grown into something much bigger, a movement for change, a beacon of hope, and a testament to the enduring power of a mother's love.